Hey guys, Level Cap here. Today we're going to be talking about the game mode Conquest as it pertains to Battlefield 1, as there's been some fairly significant changes to a game mode that's been the bread and butter of Battlefield since its inception. And Conquest has really served a very important function in the franchise in that it allows players to use vehicles, infantry, whatever that's available in the game. They can hop into it and get into an all-out massive battle. It's always offered the biggest game modes and the biggest battles. And of course, underlying this massive game mode is sort of an objective-based game that sort of brings players together, makes them fight over certain points, and there's a bunch of more rules here and there. In fact, in previous Battlefield games, the rules have been different, but Battlefield 1 has changed things up drastically. In fact, it's been the first big change to the way that Conquest plays out since its inception. In previous Battlefield games, you had a ticket system, and then they had ticket bleed. So rather than starting with 0 points at the beginning of the game, you would start with a full set of points, and one team would try and burn through the other team's points as fast as possible. And these points could be taken down by controlling flags on the map, which would cause a constant ticket bleed of the enemy team, or you could also kill enemy players, reducing their points every time that they respawned. Now, Battlefield 1 has taken player combat out of the equation. If you kill players, if you blow up a tank, if you take down an airplane, if you destroy the Zeppelin, you'll get individual points on your individual scoreboard, but it's going to make absolutely no difference on the overall team points. So for example, if I'm assaulting a point and I have to kill like 10 players on my own and then capture a flag, I'm ultimately going to be gaining as many points for my team as another player who just walked onto an uncontested flag and captured it. And without question, this concept changes up the strategic value of whether or not it's worth fighting over a certain point, or if most of your time should really be spent going for uncontested points and capping flags as quickly and as often as possible versus fighting in larger battles. Another change to the system is that rather than starting with full points for each team and having one team sort of drain their points and losing when they run out of points, now both teams start with 0 points and your objective is to get 200 points before the enemy team does. Let's talk about the pros and cons of the new Conquest game mode and ultimately if it's the right direction for Battlefield or if they're taking a step back. Let's start off with the pros. The first and most obvious is that it's easier for new players to learn. There were some aspects of the old Conquest system that were a bit confusing. Saving points and tickets when you respawned was a little confusing for players. I think a lot of people thought that you lost tickets when you died versus respawn. So when it got to the end of a round and there was only maybe 5 tickets left on one team, everybody would start yelling, "Don't respawn, don't respawn." And new players wouldn't really understand that and they could spawn in and ultimately lose the game for your team. Because when you're playing a 64-player game, it really only takes 1 or 2 people to spawn in to kind of upset that balance there. So that was kind of a weird aspect of the game system and a little bit flawed. The new system does away with that completely since player lives don't really count for anything anymore. Another aspect of the new system is that you can say bad players aren't as responsible for hurting their team as much. If a player goes out there and dies 20 or 30 times, well, you've just lost 20 or 30 tickets for your team and you actually had a pretty big negative impact. Of course, the counter argument to this is that good players also don't have as big of an effect on their team's points, where if you go out there and you get 30 or 40 kills, well, those aren't really points generated for your team either. Another thing that I'm going to list as a pro here, but we'll get into a little bit later as to whether or not it's actually a good thing, is it's totally focused on objective gameplay. So since kills and any other form of point scoring doesn't really count for your team, the only thing that matters is capturing flags and holding flags. So it sort of incites players just to go for the objectives, inciting bigger battles and more combat along the way, but it is a purely objective game mode now versus actually going for kills and doing stuff like that. Now I'm going to go over some of the cons of the new game mode here, and mind you that some of the cons are more specific to the way that I like to play the game. I love combat, I love the action. I've never been a huge fan of the strategic elements in Battlefield. I've always found them a little bit shallow, so I don't focus on them as much. So given that in mind, some of the cons are going to pertain to the strategic elements that are implicated here from the new game design. So given that, one of my biggest cons is that combat doesn't really count for anything when it comes to your team's points. So if you're killed way out of bounds by an enemy player, well, that player might have just done you a favor. You can respawn on an objective that's being attacked or respawn on a point that's very close to an objective you need to capture, being killed in this game doesn't mean anything anymore, and getting kills doesn't really mean anything anymore outside of stopping captures or anything like that. So you have stuff like aerial combat or tank combat or sniper combat, and you got these players way on the outsides of the maps, maybe not playing directly on the objectives. Killing them is not really that big of a deal since they're not capping the points or doing anything. It seems to put less of an emphasis on you as an individual or your skill, your prowess on the battlefield, so to speak. Again, if you like to play Battlefield more from a strategic perspective, this might not be a con for you, but if you like a good mixture of skill and strategy, then it probably will be a con. And within those same lines, another con that I consider is the rebalance of skill versus strategy when it comes to Conquest and how important it is. Now, in previous Conquest games, I would say that it was 50-50. Your strategy and skill was equally important. If you could kill 5 guys out in a field, but you weren't capturing a point, well, you still did a good job bleeding the enemy team's tickets. But if you're by yourself and you captured a flag in the enemy team's base, you did a pretty good job there too, because you captured a flag and you're going to be burning tickets that way as well. You had both of those as an option, strategy or skill. With the new system, I would say it puts more of a 75% emphasis on strategy and 25% on skill, which might be good if you're playing a real-time strategy game, but the strategy in Battlefield is incredibly simplistic, and such a big emphasis on it versus your skill mattering is not something that I particularly favor. Now, another potential con here is the massive change to the way that medics affect the team dynamic. Before, they could revive players, but they also saved a ticket for your team every time they revive. Now, since player deaths don't mean anything, reviving other players is not going to make a difference when it comes to saving points for your team. And so that is a huge element that is now lost from the medic class. Now, you could argue that this is a pro, saying that medics had too important of a role to play in previous Battlefield games, and now that they're less significant in terms of overall team points and score, it's better. But ultimately, I enjoyed the dynamic in that good medic players could do a very good job just by reviving their teammates and stopping a lot of ticket bleed that way. Now, another con is the strategic implications of playing the game right and what that actually means for gameplay. Now, this is a little bit carried over from previous Conquest games. It's just more emphasized in Battlefield 1. And that is just capturing points, solo capping points, ghost capping points, going around to uncontested flags and grabbing points. Hopping in a Jeep, avoiding combat whenever possible makes the most sense in Battlefield 1, and just going for those points whenever possible. I played a few rounds with the squad up guys where we just put on our tryhard pants after losing a round and getting taunted, and we won handedly just by getting in Jeeps and capturing points. We saw a little bit of combat here and there, would run into battles, but every time we got held up in a battle, I tried to urge people to get out of it and go cap the point instead, because it didn't really make a lot of sense to sort of stand and fight in an open field. Just get back in the car, drive on to the next point, capture it. That is the most effective and best way to play the game, in my opinion, if you're trying to win. But it's not really fun, and after a round or two of doing that, we all kind of reverted back to the way that we like to play, which is sort of hop into the intense battles, get a lot of kills, go crazy, feel like you're making a difference because you're chewing through enemy players and stuff like that. But now that there's no ticket bleed for combat, it feels far less effective and far less rewarding. Even though the game is telling you that you're getting points, I know from a scoreboard perspective that I'm not really helping the team out that much just by engaging in general combat. It sort of makes the way that I've always enjoyed playing Conquest feel a bit less useful, or just kind of meaningless in general. I've always liked to jump onto hotly contested points and fight in these giant battles, but it's really disappointed knowing that just some novice player or anybody can hop into a Jeep, go around and backcap flags and points and really outscore me on the scoreboard and actually do more for the team than I'm doing by just fighting in these giant battles and having a fun time, but knowing deep down now that I'm not really having much of an impact on the overall team is really kind of disappointing. Another con of the new system is that comebacks aren't quite as common or as drastic as they were before. No longer can an intense battle or ambush swing tickets quickly or drastically. I used to really enjoy joining Conquest games on the losing team and getting sort of a good squad together and making a huge effort and comeback and coming back to win the game. I feel like that happens a lot less in Battlefield 1. It could be due to the shorter game modes. In fact, it probably is due large in part to shorter game modes, but knowing that my skill, my individual skill, has less impact on my overall team score now is just kind of disappointing to me. Someone who's played Battlefield for so long and likes to be somebody who has a bigger effect on the battlefield, knowing that I matter less is not something that makes me happy. Now, when you compare the design concept of Conquest with, say, the design concept of Rush, I really enjoy the Rush concept because it basically makes getting into the big, intense, crazy combat also part of pushing the objective. So you feel like even though you're in these crazy battles and blowing tons of people up, you can also play the objective and you're doing exactly what your team needs the most. Where in Conquest, there's many moments where I'm like, ooh, I shouldn't engage that guy. I should just sort of avoid the combat here and go and capture that flag, which to me is not fun. And in a way, it sort of resembles being a pawn in like a real-time strategy game. If you're watching StarCraft players or something, they'd probably leave a bunch of units on a point just to guard it in case anybody came around. But if you employ those tactics in Battlefield, it's incredibly boring because you are that unit, and guarding a point that's not being contested is beyond boring. Even though it's an effective strategy, it doesn't translate well into first-person shooters. Now, knowing that this fairly drastic change to the way that Conquest plays out was mostly inspired to make the game mode easier and simpler to understand for new players is a little bit upsetting to a veteran player like myself, especially when there are easier solutions to making Conquest easier to understand. Points counting up instead of down is a simple change, and I can get on board with that. But removing combat points entirely from the equation seems a bit overkill. Changing it so that kills reward points instead of losing points seems more straightforward. And if you wanted to take it a step further, revives could also be made to take back a point awarded to an enemy team. So it could be the reverse of the old system where instead of losing tickets, you gain tickets. This way nobody would be yelling at you to not spawn at the end of a game, since respawns wouldn't matter, only getting the kills or reviving would matter. Putting a much bigger emphasis on strategy over skill is something that I'm not hugely on board with, and having kills not affect your team's points or score in any way whatsoever feels extremely foreign to me. Anyway, that's just my perspective from one veteran player of the franchise. I definitely like having my individual skill matter a bit more than it currently does. Let me know what you guys think, especially those of you who are in the closed alpha. Do you enjoy the new system? Do you like the old system better? Would you prefer a hybrid of the two? Let me know in the comments, and as always, I'll see you guys next time. This is Level Cap, signing off.